One gunshot, two bullets, and within 6 weeks, 6 million men were marching toward each other across Europe. Nobody planned for this. Nobody wanted a war this size. And yet, by the time it was over, it would kill 9.5 million soldiers and 7 million civilians, redraw the map of the entire world, and plant the seeds for an even bigger war just 20 years later. This is the story of how it happened. This is World War I. Part 1. The spark, 1914. By 1914, Europe was split into two armed camps, each one terrified of the other. On one side, France, Britain, and Russia, the Triple Entente bound together by a shared fear of Germany, a rising power nobody could ignore anymore. On the other, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the Triple Alliance. Germany worried about being surrounded by enemies. Austria-Hungary was an aging empire cracking at the seams. And Italy? Italy was just waiting for an opportunity. All it took to light the fuse was one bullet fired in one city by one 19-year-old. On June 28th, in Sarajevo, a Slav nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Serbia refused to bow down, and within days the Austrian army was shelling Belgrade. Here's where it gets terrifying. This wasn't supposed to be a world war. It was supposed to be a local dispute, but every country had promises to keep. Russia felt honor-bound to defend Serbia, a fellow Slavic nation, so it mobilized its army. Germany had promised to back Austria-Hungary, and its generals actually welcomed a fight with Russia now, while they still had the advantage. So Germany declared war on Russia. And then, because it knew France would join in, declared war on France too. Germany had a plan for this exact scenario. The Schlieffen Plan. Smash through neutral Belgium, encircle Paris, knock France out fast, then turn east to deal with the slower mobilizing Russians. One problem, it required marching straight through Belgium, and Britain had promised to protect Belgian neutrality. So when German boots crossed that border, Britain sent an ultimatum. It was ignored. Britain declared war. In a matter of weeks, a regional assassination had become a continent-wide catastrophe. 6 million men were now marching to war. Not everyone jumped in immediately, though. Italy stayed neutral. Technically, the alliance only covered defensive wars. And across the Atlantic, President Wilson kept America firmly out of it. For now, the first blood. German troops smashed into Belgium and committed brutal massacres against civilians along the way. Atrocities that Allied propaganda would exaggerate even further, turning global opinion against Germany almost overnight. Meanwhile, France, completely unaware of the scale of Germany's encircling maneuver, launched its own offensive straight into German territory. It was a disaster. Huge losses on both sides. The British Expeditionary Force clashed with Germany at Mons and was forced into retreat. Germany's advance seemed unstoppable. Until the Allies made their final stand at the River Marne, just 40 miles from Paris. A desperate counterattack saved the French capital and pushed the Germans back. The cost? 250,000 casualties, combined. Both sides then tried to outflank each other in what's called the Race to the Sea, culminating in the brutal First Battle of Ypres. Neither side broke through. And so, along a 350-mile scar across Europe, both armies did the only thing left to do. They dug in. Trench warfare had begun. Nobody knew it yet, but this hole in the ground would become home for millions of men, for years. The war beneath the waves at sea, Britain, with the most powerful navy on Earth, clamped a blockade on Germany, cutting off food and supplies. Germany's answer came from underwater. A British cruiser, HMS Pathfinder, became the first ship in history sunk by a submarine-launched torpedo. A new kind of war had just begun beneath the waves. Disaster in the east while the west dug trenches, the east saw catastrophe. Russian forces invaded German territory and were annihilated at the Battle of Tannenberg, 90,000 men taken prisoner, an entire army destroyed. Their mistake? Broadcasting orders over the radio, completely uncoded, for the enemy to hear. Austria-Hungary didn't fare any better, humiliated in Serbia, and losing over 300,000 men in a failed offensive against Russia. A world at war, this wasn't just a European fight anymore. It reached into Africa, where German and British colonial forces clashed. It reached into Asia, where Japan, honoring a treaty with Britain, seized Germany's naval base at Tsingtao. It reached into the Pacific, where a German admiral won a stunning victory at Coronel. only to be hunted down and destroyed weeks later at the Falkland Islands. By Christmas, in some sections of the front, exhausted soldiers on both sides laid down their weapons and played football in no man's land. It was a brief, human moment in a war that had already killed 1 million men in just 5 months. Part 2, The Meat Grinder, 1915. By January 1915, the war had already devoured 1 million lives, and it was just getting started. Germany introduced airships, Zeppelins, to bomb British towns, launching one of history's first strategic bombing campaigns. At sea, Germany answered Britain's blockade with a blockade of its own, unrestricted submarine warfare. Any ship in British waters was now a target. Poison in the wind at the Second Battle of Ypres, Germany unleashed something the world had never seen on this scale: chlorine gas. A green cloud rolled across the battlefield, and Allied troops fled their own trenches in terror. It didn't win Germany the battle, but it opened the door to a chemical arms race that would haunt the rest of the war: the Gallipoli gamble. The Allies tried something bold: force open the Dardanelles Strait, threaten Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war in one stroke. Warships bombarded Turkish forts, but mines sank 3 battleships, and the naval assault was called off. So they tried again, this time landing troops, including the Anzacs, soldiers from Australia and New Zealand making their first mark on the war. They were pinned to the beaches almost immediately by fierce Turkish resistance. It would become one of the most infamous failures of the entire war. A crime in the shadow of war, the same day as the Gallipoli landings, the Ottoman government began the systematic deportation and mass killing of ethnic Armenians. Over 1 million men, women, and children were killed. The Allies called it a crime against humanity. To this day, the full reckoning of what happened remains disputed by the Turkish government. The Lusitania in May, a German U-boat torpedoed the passenger liner Lusitania without warning, killing nearly 1,200 people, 128 of them American. The world was outraged. Germany insisted it was a legitimate target. But America was now watching very, very closely. Trapped in the trenches on the Western Front, offensive after offensive achieved almost nothing. The Second Battle of Artois cost the Allies 130,000 casualties for a gain of a few thousand yards. In the skies above, Germany's new Fokker Eindecker, the first plane able to fire a machine gun through its own propeller, gave Germany control of the air. Allied pilots called it the Fokker Scourge. For good reason. Italy, lured by Allied promises of territory, switched sides and joined the war against its former ally, Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, Russia was in freefall. German troops marched into Warsaw. The Tsar personally took command of the army, a decision that would tie his own fate directly to Russia's battlefield failures. At Gallipoli, reinforcements landed at Suvla Bay, but the deadlock held. Heat, flies, disease, and constant fighting ground down both sides. By year's end, the Allies quietly abandoned Gallipoli, pulling out 83,000 men in one of the best-executed retreats of the entire war. Not a single soldier was lost in the evacuation, a rare moment of pure competence in a year defined by disaster. 1915 ended with staggering losses and nothing to show for them. And yet, both sides were already planning something even bigger for 1916. Part 3, Attrition, 1916. Nobody expected this. A short, glorious war had become an industrialized slaughterhouse. Women had entered the workforce by the thousands, replacing men sent to the front. Naval blockades were starving both sides of food and fuel. This was no longer a war anyone thought they could win quickly. It had become a war of attrition, of grinding the enemy down until they simply had nothing left. Verdun, the mincing machine Germany chose a symbolic French fortress town to attack, not necessarily to capture it, but to force France to defend it at any cost. German General von Falkenhayn's plan, in his own chilling words, was to bleed France white. Verdun became one of the most horrifying battles in human history. Entire divisions were fed into the line and destroyed almost as fast as they arrived. It would grind on for the better part of a year, costing 700,000 casualties combined. Blood in the water, blood on land. At the Battle of Jutland, the only major naval clash of the war, Britain lost more ships, but Germany's fleet retreated to port and never came out again for the rest of the conflict. Britain claimed the win where it mattered most, control of the seas. On the Eastern Front, Russian General Brusilov launched a stunningly successful surprise offensive, taking 200,000 prisoners and forcing Germany to pull troops away from Verdun. It was one of Russia's greatest achievements of the war, and it cost them almost everything they had left to give. The Somme, the worst day in British history on the Western Front, Britain and France launched their biggest offensive yet, the Battle of the Somme. The plan was simple. Days of artillery bombardment would destroy German defenses, then infantry would walk across no man's land and take the line. It didn't work. In a matter of hours on the very first day, Britain suffered 57,000 casualties. It remains the worst single day in the history of the British Army. And yet the battle continued for 5 more brutal months, ending with 600,000 Allied casualties for just 10 miles of ground. In the middle of this carnage, a new weapon rolled onto the battlefield for the first time: the tank. It wasn't ready yet, too few, too unreliable, but the age of armored warfare had begun. Romania's disaster encouraged by Russia's success, Romania joined the Allies and was almost immediately overrun by a joint German, Bulgarian, and Austro-Hungarian counteroffensive. 250,000 Romanian casualties for a war that had barely started for them. By the end of 1916, both sides told themselves the same lie, that this brutal math, trading lives for ground, was somehow a winning strategy. Because surely, eventually, the other side would run out of men first. Part 4. The world joins in 1917. Germany knew something the Allies didn't want to admit. In a long war, Germany would lose. So its leaders made a desperate gamble: resume unrestricted submarine warfare and starve Britain into surrender within 6 months. There was just one problem. That meant sinking American ships too. The telegram that changed everything. British intelligence intercepted a secret German telegram, the Zimmermann telegram, encouraging Mexico to attack the United States if America entered the war. When it went public, it was the final push America needed. The United States declared war on Germany. Revolution. In Russia, years of catastrophic losses and food shortages finally broke the country. Riots turned into revolution. The Tsar abdicated. A provisional government tried to keep fighting, but Russian soldiers were already deserting in droves. Mutiny in the trenches. French General Nivelle promised a war-winning offensive. Instead, it collapsed into the same bloody stalemate as everything before it, and this time French soldiers had had enough. Entire units mutinied, refusing to attack. Nivelle was sacked. His replacement, General Pétain, made a simple promise: no more suicidal attacks. Passchendaele, the Sea of M. The British launched their major offensive of the year in Belgium, remembered by history as Passchendaele. Heavy shelling destroyed the region's drainage systems, and relentless rain turned the entire battlefield into a swamp of mud. Men and horses drowned in shell craters. After 3 months and 240,000 British casualties, the attack was called off, having gained almost nothing. A second Russian revolution later that year, Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in a second revolution. Lenin wanted one thing above all else: Russia out of this war. Tanks take the stage. At Cambrai, Britain launched the first true mass tank assault in history, nearly 400 tanks smashing through German lines in a single day. It was a glimpse of the future of warfare. But the breakthrough couldn't be held, and the gains slipped away within days. By the end of 1917, Russia had collapsed out of the war entirely, but America had arrived. Germany knew this was its last real chance and began planning one final all-out gamble for the following spring. Part 5. The Final Reckoning. 1918. Germany was desperate. Britain's blockade was starving its people at home. But with Russia out of the war, hundreds of thousands of German troops were now free to fight on the Western Front, and Germany had one last shot at victory before American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers. Ludendorff's gamble. German General Erich Ludendorff launched a massive spring offensive using new infiltration tactics that shattered the British line and sent an entire army into retreat. For a moment, it looked like Germany might actually win. Britain and Australian troops scrambled to improvise a defense outside Amiens, and held. The German advance shifted north, then south, chasing a breakthrough that never quite came. At the River Marne, German troops were finally stopped, just as fresh American soldiers entered the fight for the first time. America arrives. By mid-1918, there were nearly 1 million American soldiers in France, with 10,000 more arriving every single day. At the Second Battle of the Marne, Ludendorff's offensive was finally, decisively broken. Germany's last gamble had failed, at a cost of over 600,000 casualties. The 100 Days. Now, for the first time in years, the Allies went on the offensive and kept going. At the Battle of Amiens, British, Australian, Canadian, and French troops advanced 7 miles in a single day. German General Ludendorff himself called it the Black Day of the German Army. German soldiers began surrendering by the thousands. This was the beginning of the 100 Days offensive. Trench warfare, as the world had known it for 4 straight years, was finally over. The Germans were in full, continuous retreat. The dominoes fall one by one, the Central Powers collapsed. Bulgaria signed an armistice. The Ottoman Empire signed an armistice. At the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, the Austro-Hungarian army disintegrated entirely, and 300,000 prisoners were taken. Austria-Hungary signed an armistice too. At the German naval base of Kiel, sailors ordered on a suicidal final attack against Britain chose mutiny instead. Revolution spread across Germany. The Kaiser abdicated. 11 am on November 11, 1918, a German delegation signed the armistice inside a railway carriage in the forest of Campigny. The guns would fall silent at 11 o'clock that morning. But here's the part that still stops people cold. Fighting continued right up until the very last second. American Private Henry Gunter was killed charging a German machine gun position at 10:59, 1 minute before the armistice took effect. He's believed to be the very last soldier killed in the First World War. Epilogue: a world remade. The Paris Peace Conference reshaped the entire globe. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to shrink its military, pay massive reparations, surrender territory, lose its colonies, and formally accept blame for starting the war. That last clause would leave a wound in German pride that history would not let heal quietly. Old empires vanished overnight. Poland reappeared on the map after 100 years. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia rose from the ruins of Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire was carved apart, its pieces handed to European control, planting the seeds of conflicts that are still unresolved today. When the guns finally fell silent, the war had claimed 9.5 million soldiers, 1 in every 8 men who fought. 21 million more were wounded. 7 million civilians were dead. An entire generation of young men across Europe simply gone. The old world had been buried in the mud of the trenches. And though nobody could see it yet, the terms of this peace were already writing the opening chapter of an even greater war just 2 decades away.